Is God real? Are the stories in the Bible true? I need answers.
Welcome to A Closer Look with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy that you chose to spend the next hour with us as we delve into the study of God's Word. We can't do what we don't know. Here at Shiloh, we want to spend time studying the Word so that we can rightly apply the Word to our daily living and make a difference in our community and in our world for Jesus Christ. Won't you join us now for a closer look into God's Word? We want to wrap up this in this Bible study experience, our series on God's message to the African American church. We said that we were studying Revelation chapters 2 and 3, where Christ speaks to 7 churches of Asia Minor, and that our study was going to be from the perspective of the African American church, trying to draw out important points that would be helpful and beneficial to our church. Not that we're trying to say that our church is the only church, but we are an African American congregation, and we seek to provide insights that are beneficial to those people that we most commonly serve. That does not mean that if you're not African American, we're telling you not to pay any attention. We're telling you to tune out. We're glad to have you with us. But we feel it incumbent upon us to tailor, to fine-tune our message to the African American church experience. Thus far, just let me give you a brief review, and then we'll talk about the final church, which is the church at Laodicea. Some people call it Laodicea. I pronounce it Laodicea. Somebody will tell me whether I'm right or I'm wrong. But there were 6 messages that we have covered up to this point, beginning with Revelation chapter 2. The first message was to the church at Ephesus, and the concern that Christ had, the condemnation, as some people call it, that Christ lifted up to the church at Ephesus was that they had forsaken their first love. And we wanted to make the point, we tried to make the point, that contrary to how this text has been presented in the past, where the first love is Christ or is God, the first love that is actually meant here is more correctly termed the love that you had at first rather than first love, and that makes a difference. We recognize that our first love should always be to Christ, but when you read in the context of what was said to the church at Ephesus, Christ wasn't saying that the Ephesian Christians had lost a love for God. What he was saying was they had lost a love for their fellow brothers and sisters, that somehow or other they had forsaken, they had stopped equating love for one another as being love for God, even though that is what Jesus taught. And the message that we said is important for the African American church is that we return to being a service-modeled church. In the 21st century, much of the African American church has moved away from the service model. Historically, the African American church, and I'm not talking about denomination, I'm talking about just in general, the African American church was the hub of the African American community. It was not just the worship center, it was the education center, it was the bank, it was the social center, it was the counseling center. It was the hub of the African American community. Well, over time and with the progresses that we have made in American society with integration and the things that come along with integration, much of that has been lost within the African American church community. Yet it should not be lost altogether. I know that there are public schools that are now available to our children. I know that there are other social and service organizations that exist within the African American community, but the church must never lose its role as a service center for its community. How do we show love for one another? We serve one another. And we should not become so caught up and enamored with the other aspects of our society and of our lives that we lose the service aspect of our church life. That's the message to Ephesus. Second church was the church at Smyrna. The concern with the church at Smyrna that Christ lifted up was that they were facing severe suffering. And he tells them, don't fold because of suffering. The message to the African American church in that regard is that we should be a church that champions the needs of the marginalized. Do you see where a pattern is beginning to emerge? The first message was be service modeled. The second message to the African American church is that we should champion the needs of the marginalized. Now, the marginalized don't have a racial boundary. They are marginalized people of all races. But when we talk primarily about marginalization, we call this the message to the African American church because more than anyone else, black folk are marginalized. More than any other minority in this nation, black folk are marginalized. And so if we are to withstand the sufferings that are brought upon us by society, because much of the suffering that we endure is systemic, it is a part of the when I say systemic, I'm not saying systematic. I'm saying systemic, which means that it exists within the systems of our society. Racism and bias and discrimination exist within the systems of government, within the systems of business and industry, within the systems of education. So I'm not saying that it is exclusive to black folk, that black folk are the only folk that are marginalized. I'm saying that by and large, black folk are marginalized because of our history. And so the message to the African American church is don't fold because of suffering, but be champions of the needs of the marginalized. Third church, the church at Pergamum. The condemnation to that church from Christ was that they were giving in to enticement. And the enticement had to do with inducements toward wealth and greed. And so the message to the African American church is be a church that resists capitalistic greed. Again, a pattern should be emerging here. We're talking about systematic marginalization, or systemic marginalization, not systematic, systemic marginalization. One of the ways in which systems marginalize is that it causes us to desire the greed of capitalism. America is a capitalistic society. No way around it, no way to get past it, no way to ignore it, no way to obfuscate it, and it's not going away. But the church is not built on capitalism. The church is not built on greed. The church is built on mutual love for one another that models the love that Christ has shown toward us. So when we see local congregations and perhaps even denominations falling away from the idea of love as the mandate for our service to one another and how we operate, and we fall into this whole idea of greed, selfishness, and capitalism, then we're falling into the condemnation that Christ gives to the church at Pergamum, which was they were giving in to enticement. And far too much in the modern day 21st century church, far too much in the modern day 21st century African American church, we see where enticement is winning out the day. You know, before many of our churches actually stood on the principle of tithes and offerings. And there was a time when we couldn't teach tithes and offerings, not because we didn't know that it was in there, but because our churches simply wouldn't respond to it. Our members wouldn't respond to it. So we had a dues system, and we asked people to pay so much in dues. And then we found that dues weren't enough to actually sustain the church, particularly if it was a church that was seeking to be progressive in the way of facilities and in the way of programming that it offered. They needed more than dues. Still weren't ready to talk about tithes and offerings. Tithe being giving back to God proportionate, 10% to what the Lord has given to you. Still weren't ready to talk about tithes and offerings. So we looked for other ways to entice people and induce people to give to the church. Growing up in this church, I watched us do suppers all over the place. Chickens and pigs lost their lives for the brick and mortar that made up our churches, and we had raffles, and we had souvenir books where we sold advertisements to people, and we did all kinds of things to try to raise money because we had a need to pay for the facilities that we're in. This sanctuary that I'm standing in right now was not built on tithes and offerings. I don't want to break anybody's feelings or hurt anybody's feelings about that. This church wasn't built on tithes and offerings. This church was built on suppers and raffles and giveaways and souvenir books. And it wasn't until after the mortgage was paid that Pastor Charles T. Smith was persistent enough to impress upon the congregation the need to move into tithes and offerings. Now, tithes and offerings paid for the rest of the facilities, but this sanctuary that I'm in, this was built by chickens and pigs and suppers and other things. Inducements, enticements were the order of the day. Not to get wealthy, simply to meet the need. The problem with the somebody's sitting there saying, well, where's he going with this? I'm going with this. The problem with the 21st century church is that there is a movement within the 21st century church to continue in this capitalistic greed, to continue in this desire for selfishness, so that the message of the church is not about salvation, it's not about service, it's not about upward mobility through hard work and education, it's not about supporting education, it's about getting rich. You're next in line for a miracle. Name it and claim it. It's about destiny and prosperity and things of that sort. All of that is cover for capitalism. It is churchifying capitalism. And it's been going on with African American churches for some time. What's disheartening to me is that I don't just see it happening with older churches and pastors. I see younger churches and pastors doing this now. I see young men and women in their 20s and 30s who have grabbed on to this capitalistic greed model for church, and they are promoting it as though it is the gospel. It is not the gospel. It is a shrewd, ugly enticement that draws you away from what the church is really supposed to be about. And so Jesus says to the church at Pergamum, don't give in to enticement. And the message to the African American church is we must be a church that resists capitalistic greed. Does the church need money? Absolutely. By no stretch of the imagination can the church do its work without money. But God tells us how to give, not sell, give. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him. Everyone as he proposeth in his heart, so let him give. Bring all the tithe to the storehouse, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts. The church is to be built on a system of regular, proportionate giving. The church is not to be a salesman of goods and services in order to enrich people or to sell people on the idea of enrichment. I could go on, but that's not really what I wanted to talk about. I'm just trying to review what the message is to these various churches. The fourth church was the church at Thyatira. And the question for that church is, would they stop being moved to a place of irrelevance by false doctrine? They had lost their idea of what they were supposed to be. Again, the model, if you follow what is said to each of these churches, they all fall within the same general area. The message is generally the same. Be who Christ called you to be. The message for the African American church today is be a church that tenaciously stands on Christ's love ethic. If the church is not about love, then what is the church about? The church is not about sin. The church talks about sin, but the church is not about sin. The church is about love. Jesus didn't build the church on sin. Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus asked the disciples. Peter responds. Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The church is built upon who Jesus is, and Jesus is not about sin. Jesus is about love, which is the remedy for sin. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. We can't allow ourselves to move away from the love doctrine. We can't allow ourselves to move into anybody else's doctrine besides love. We can't even allow ourselves to get caught up in the trappings of pseudo-spiritualism. The things that are kind of attached to spirituality but are not spirituality. What kinds of things are you talking about? Miracle things. You know, everybody loves to talk about miracles. Miracles are not spirituality. I love the way John talks about miracles. John, who also is the writer of the Revelation. I love the way John talks about miracles. He never uses the word miracles. He calls them signs. And if it's a sign, that means that it's pointing to something else. Jesus does something that is truly miraculous, truly unique, something that only Jesus can do, but he does it as a sign pointing to something else. And what it's pointing to is his divinity. It's pointing to who he is and what his purpose in coming was. And sometimes we lose sight of who Jesus is and what we are supposed to be about, and we get caught up in the trappings of pseudo-spiritualism, para-spiritualism, stuff that is kind of linked in, but is not really what it's all about. You know, I'm a coffee drinker, but I'm a different kind of coffee drinker from some of y'all. Some of y'all are black coffee drinkers. You don't put nothing in your coffee. You just drink it black. No sugar, no cream, no nothing. And God bless you if you can do that. Never been able to do that. I like to put a lot of cream and a lot of sugar in my coffee. So much so that some folk who watch me drink coffee say, you just want a little coffee with your cream and sugar. What's my point? My point is the main thing is the coffee, not the cream or the sugar. The cream and the sugar are para coffee. They are called alongside the coffee. They help accent the coffee, but they're not the coffee. So if I just wanted cream and sugar without the coffee, it wouldn't taste very good, wouldn't be very appetizing, wouldn't be very pleasant or pleasing. But the point that they're making is, I put so much cream and sugar in the coffee that somehow or other the coffee gets lost. We have to be careful that we don't get so caught up in the para stuff surrounding church that we lose sight of what the church is really all about. Church ain't about miracles. By the way, for all the service that the church does, the church is not first and foremost a service center. The church is first and foremost an agency of salvation. And after salvation is accomplished, then the church seeks to heighten and elevate the quality of life of those who have come into Christ by championing those things that help enhance the quality of life. Those things include education and social services and things of that sort. But the church is not meant to be a social service center. The church is meant to be an agency of salvation that also provides social service. The church is not meant to be an educational center. The church is meant to be an agency of salvation that also provides support for educational services. There is a difference. And that's the difference that is pointed out here when we are told that we should tenaciously stand on Christ's love ethic. Then there's the church at Sardis. And we made the point when we talked about that church that it is the only one of the 7 churches where Jesus had nothing good to say about it. What he does say is you have movement, but you don't have life. You have activity, but you have no purpose to the activity. And so the message to the African American church is that we have to be a church that has proper priority. Again, all of the messages fall within the same realm, the same system of thinking. We have to be a church that has proper priority. Activity without purpose serves no point and is not beneficial to anyone. There are a lot of churches that I know that have a lot of activities, but they really serve no purpose. They're not about lifting up the name of Jesus in a relevant, meaningful, and purposeful way. And much of what we do in churches, about to make somebody mad, much of what we do in churches could be done anywhere else. The only reason why it's done in the church is because somebody in the church decided we want to do it. School assembly should not be done in the church. School assembly should be done at school. What we have to do is fix our minds and our hearts on doing that which lifts Christ and helps us to walk closer to him as we share him with others. And too much of the activity that takes place in churches is just activity that has no point, that has no purpose. The 6th church was the church at Philadelphia. And just the opposite of the church at Sardis, where Jesus had nothing good to say about that church, the church at Philadelphia, Jesus has nothing bad to say about that church. He simply urges them not to fret over the fact that they have little strength. And the message for the African American church is that we must be a church that relies on Christ and not on worldly power. You don't have to be big in the eyes of the world in order to do the will of Christ. And too much of capitalistic influence in our churches causes us to be competitive about things that ultimately don't matter. Ultimately, it does not matter that we are as big as somebody else, or that we are as well known as somebody else, or that we bring in as many dollars as somebody else. Those things ultimately do not matter. Do we need money? Yes. How much money do you need? You need enough to sustain what it is that you're trying to do. And that shouldn't be something that you compare to what somebody else down the street or around the corner or across town is doing. Do we need people? Absolutely, we do. How many do you need? Enough to do the work. And let me assure you, when it comes to doing the work of Christ, Most of the work that's done in the church is done by a very small number of people. I don't care how many folk you have on a church roll. You break that down to about 5 to 10% of that number, and those are the people who are actually doing the work. We get caught up in things that ultimately do not matter. We think that our strength is in the things that the world calls strength. We want to be the biggest. We want to be the wealthiest. We want to be the best. We want to be at the top of the list. Those things ultimately do not matter when it comes to doing the work of Christ. All the church has to do is rely on Christ. If the church relies on Christ, God has a way of taking little and doing a whole lot with it. 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread fed thousands of people. God doesn't need a huge crowd in order to accomplish his will. So those are the messages to the 6 previous churches. We finally get to church number 7, the church at Laodicea. And the message is found in Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 through 22. Write to Laodicea, to the angel of the church, God's yes, the faithful and accurate witness, the first of God's creation, says, I know you inside and out, and find little to my liking. You're not cold, you're not hot. Far better to be either cold or hot. You're stale. You're stagnant. You make me want to vomit. You brag, I'm rich, I've got it made, I need nothing from anyone. Oblivious that in fact you are a pitiful blind beggar, threadbare and homeless. Here's what I want you to do. Buy your gold from me. Gold that's been through the refiner's fire. Then you'll be rich. Buy your clothes from me, clothes designed in heaven. You've gone around half naked long enough. And buy medicine for your eyes from me so you can see, really see. The people I love, I call to account, prod and correct and guide so that they'll live at their best. Up on your feet then, about face, run after God. Look at me. I stand at the door. I knock. If you hear me call and open the door, I'll come right in and sit down to supper with you. Conquerors will sit alongside me at the head table, just as I, having conquered, took the place of honor at the side of my Father. That's my gift to the conquerors. Are your ears awake? Listen. Listen to the wind words, the Spirit blowing through the churches. The church at Laodicea was noted throughout the Roman province of Asia for its wealth. The community was noted for its wealth, and the members of the church were also noted for their wealth, for their commercial life, and for their medical practice. It was the banking center of Asia. It was the most prosperous of the 7 cities, and therefore the most prosperous of the 7 churches. Many large and beautiful homes were built in this city, and many of them were probably owned by Christians. The city had a flourishing clothing industry. A unique breed of black sheep was raised around this area, and the glossy black wool was woven into special clothes that were sold there. The city was also noted for its eye and ear salve. The medical cult of Asclepius was located there, and it dated back to 3 centuries before Christ. Consequently, the church had a problem in that it was estranged from its commitment to Christ. Instead, it was committed to its own wealth. It was committed to its own success. The great danger to the Laodicean church had to do with their inability to recognize the priority of the infilling of the Holy Spirit due to a lack of motivation to grow and to strive and to achieve. It was due to an over-reliance on intellectualism. It led to complacency and a lack of desire to grow closer to God. And as this was a danger in the church at Laodicea, this is a danger to some African American churches as well. And I have to be very careful about how I lay this out so that nobody thinks that I'm opposed to intellectualism within the church. I am not. But we have to be careful that we don't substitute the worship of Christ with the worship of our own intellect. That we don't think ourselves into estrangement from God. I always try to lift up African American writings by African American pastors, educators, authors that might be helpful in what it is that we're trying to talk about. As I've done with the other churches, I want to lift up one today. It is entitled Church Administration in the Black Perspective. It was written 40 years ago by Floyd Massey and Samuel B. McKinney. It served as the textbook in many ways to the whole concept of holistic ministry that guided the pastorate of Charles Turnbull Smith. He read church administration in the black perspective, and he applied church administration in the black perspective to his pastoral ministry here for the years that he served. And he served this church for 50 years. And so the whole idea of holistic ministry is rooted in the teachings that come from church administration in the black perspective. It's in its 4th or 5th edition. If you want to go and get it, it's on Google. Google is a wonderful device. You can go get it, you can download it, you can read it for yourself. Basically, Massey and McKinney describe in broad terms 3 types of African American churches. There is what they call the mass church, there is the class church, and there is the mass class church. The mass church was comprised primarily of low-income, low-education members. This is not meant to be insulting or demeaning, simply telling you what it is. These churches comprise the greatest percentage of African American churches because they reflect the greatest percentage of African American people. Again, that's not an insult, it's just a statement of fact. These churches were characterized by a strong commitment to worship that was animated and energetic, and they were committed to evangelism. But they suffered from a lack of financial revenue to meet their goals. Class churches were comprised primarily of upper middle and upper income high education members. These churches were the smallest percentage of African American churches for obvious reasons, because they were the smallest component of the African American community. Their worship experiences were more liturgical, less animated, and less energetic. By the way, most of these churches were not necessarily Baptist. Many other denomination, other Protestant churches, Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, Congregational churches comprise these class churches, Episcopalian. These churches were made up of those made up of that denomination. There were Baptist churches that fell into that category, but they were a very small percentage, especially at the time that Massey and McKinney wrote. Because of their economic status, these churches had the resources to perform effective ministry. But because many of the ministry issues did not affect them specifically, they lacked the motivation to respond to them. They didn't need a scholarship program to put their kids through school. They just put their kids through school because they had access to the money. If they wanted to be a part of a social group that was not barred from them by virtue of racism, they were a part of it. So the church served less as the hub of their community as it did the hub for the masses of black people, because they relied more on their wealth and what their wealth allowed them to have than they did upon the church. The third church that Massey and McKinney lift up were called mass class churches. And these were the strongest of churches. They have the energy and the commitment to worship that the mass church has, but it's combined with the resources and the opportunity of the class church. These churches are motivated to address pregnant social justice issues because they more closely identify with them. And it was, I said that this book served as a guide for how Shiloh's ministry evolved under the pastorate of Charles T. Smith. He believed in something that he called holistic ministry. And by holistic ministry, he meant that the church should not simply serve the spiritual needs of individuals, but should serve the total needs of individuals, the economic needs, the physical needs, the social needs, the academic needs, as well as the spiritual needs. And that only if we approach people and their lives from a holistic approach do we model the teachings of Christ. Jesus did not simply come into the world and go to the cross and die for our sin. Before he died for our sin, Jesus walked and talked and lived among us. And in that, he met the needs of hurting people. Jesus fed the hungry. And Jesus clothed the naked, and Jesus opened the eyes of the blind, and Jesus caused the lame to be able to walk. Jesus uplifted those who were emotionally isolated from society and ostracized from society. The woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and she was condemned by Orthodox Jewish religion. Jesus uplifted her and restored her self-esteem. The woman that he talked to at Jacob's well, who had a rough past, Jesus said, about your past isn't as important as your future. If you embrace Christ, if you embrace me as the Messiah, you can have a far more bright future. Jesus was not just concerned about you going to heaven when you die. He was concerned about the quality of life as you live. He comes to a fellow at the pool of Bethesda who's been there for 38 years, and he asks him, do you want to get well? He doesn't ask him, do you want to go to heaven? He asks him, do you want to get well? And then he tells him to take up your bed and walk. If we are to be the church that Christ modeled, then we must be concerned about the overall total needs of people as well, not just the needs of our spirits, not just it is not to say that spiritual needs are not the most important needs. They are, because the spirit of the individual, the soul, is the only thing that lasts. Everything else fades away. But Jesus taught that God is concerned about the total person. And if we are to be the church that God called us to be, then we must be a church that is concerned about the total person. What does that have to do with mass church, and mass class church? And how does that relate to the church of Laodicea? Mass class churches have the energy to do, have the motivation to do, and have the resources to do. And so the idyllic church within the African American community is a church that not only is motivated to serve God, but has the resources to do it effectively. And that's not the mass church, and that's not the class church. It's the mass class church. But incumbent upon the mass class church is that you recognize that your reliance is on the presence of Christ, and not on anything that you bring to the table in and of yourself. The problem with the church at Laodicea is that they were relying on themselves and not on God. They were relying on their resources and not on God. And the problem with many of our churches today in the African American community is that we rely on our own resources or on resources that we can appropriate from other places rather than rely on God. We have to always recognize that Christ is the center of the church. And if Christ is the center of the church, then there are things that we will not do, even though they are available to us to do. There are practices that we should refrain from, because even though it's there, even though it's available, it's contrary to the love ethic of Christ. It's contrary to reliance upon God. I say all the time, we have to be careful that we don't fall so in love with our blessing that we substitute the blessing for the blesser. Christ is the blesser. Christ is the head. Christ is the center. And Christ bestows upon us any number of wonderful blessings. But we must never become so wrapped up in the blessing that we lose sight of Christ as the blesser. To the church at Laodicea, Jesus says something interesting. He says, I wish that you were either hot or cold. And that statement requires some kind of explanation. Because if you don't get it right, you'll leave with a misunderstanding. Jesus is not saying, I'd rather you be with me or be against me, when he says, I'd rather you be hot or cold. That's our modern day vulgar colloquial response to what that says, or understanding, translation of what that says. It's really not what he's saying. Laodicea had no water supply. They got their water through an aqueduct that came from Hierapolis. Hierapolis had hot springs, and an aqueduct was built 6 miles from Hierapolis to Laodicea that would allow the water to travel from Hierapolis to Laodicea in order to provide water for the people. Traveling at that distance, the hot water had partly cooled down. And if you tried to use it, it would be nauseating. If you tried to consume it, it would be nauseating and repulsive to the taste. For the water to be optimally useful, it either had to be heated or cooled, depending upon the need. If you needed it to cook, you would heat it. If you needed it to drink or to bathe, perhaps, you would cool it. Depending upon the need, you had to do one or the other. To do either, to either heat it up or cool it off, demanded that there be effort and commitment. But to do neither, to just accept the water as it was, represented a lack of commitment. So, with that understanding of what Jesus is saying, what the message is to the African American church is that you have a problem with compromise. When you want to make something lukewarm, you mix together hot and cold. The church at Laodicea was compromising spiritually for comfort's sake. It's much more comfortable to attend church where nobody takes doctrine seriously, where for comfort's sake we avoid discussions over social justice issues. I know that for the last several weeks, and really for the last several months, when I was talking about social justice issues in the church, that I have incurred at the least the concern, and at the most the wrath of some people, because some people have taken the time to write me and let me know how upset they are. But it's much more comfortable to simply do what we've been doing and not lift up the real issues that tend to detract from the power of the church and tend to detract from the quality of life that Christ has for us. It's much more easy to just lay around and continue doing what we've been doing. It takes no effort to do that. If the water that came from Hierapolis to Laodicea was lukewarm and you just left it at lukewarm, that meant that you weren't committed to doing anything with it than just leaving it like it is. To have to heat it up, you had to do something. To have to cool it down, you had to do something. But to just take it like it was, all you had to do was take it like it was. The problem with the African American church is that we will not commit to Christ. And there are various reasons why we will not commit to Christ. I preached about this Sunday. I don't know how many weeks out we're going to be when this is shown on television, but for those who are watching me live right now on live stream, we preached about this very thing Sunday when we talked about love. There are certain things that we lift up about Christ that are not proportionate but are equivalent. And when it comes to love, love is not a proportionate thing. Love is an equivalent thing. We are not to love similar to how Christ loved us. We are to love exactly as Christ loved us. And what does that mean? That means that we have to make a commitment to Christ's love ethic as Christ made a commitment to loving us. You can't love with a but. You can't love and say except. You can't qualify your love that way and say that you love like Christ. Agape, the love that Christ showed toward us, is a love that has no limit and no restriction. God loves us simply because we exist. We don't do anything to merit his love. That's good. But what's also good is that we can't do anything to lose his love. I want to be very careful. Can't always do this on Sunday morning, but here we are in Bible study. I can do this here. I want to be careful when I say that, because somebody will take that to mean that we can just be whoever we are, and that's all right. God does call us to be our best selves. We were talking a few minutes ago about the woman that was caught in the act of adultery and was condemned by Orthodox Judaism. Jesus said they wanted Jesus to authorize their stoning of the woman. And Jesus said, well, the one who's without sin, let him throw the first stone. And no one threw a stone, and all the people walked away. And then it was just Jesus and the woman there. And Jesus looks up at the woman and says, where are your condemners? And she says, they've gone. There's no one. He said, well, if they don't condemn you, neither do I. Now, that's not the end of the story. He tells the woman, I don't condemn you either. That's his love. But then he challenges the woman to do better. He says, go and sin no more. Too much of what we say about the love ethic of Christ causes some people to say, well, then that means that we can just do whatever we want. No, it's not that you can do whatever you want. It is in response to the love that Christ has shown toward you. You aspire to live more like Christ. You aspire to elevate your living to a Christ-like, acceptable lifestyle. That you rise above to be who Christ has called you to be. But if they don't make it, you still don't stop loving them. Do you know somebody who has tried to give up substance abuse? Whatever substance it is, alcohol, drugs, pills. Do you know somebody who is really trying hard to give up substance abuse and does it for a minute, But then something happens, some tragedy happens, some weakness comes upon their lives. It really doesn't matter what the cause is. But a weak moment comes in their lives, and they're back to doing what they had stopped doing. Do you stop loving the person simply because they fell back? Be careful how you answer. Because everybody who's watching me right now has fallen back at some point. Everybody who is watching me, hearing the sound of my voice right now, you've had moments where you promised you were going to be one way, and you turned out to be something else. Everybody who's watching me has had this experience where you got up in the morning and you verbally said, Lord, I'm not going to do that anymore. Lord, I'm going to be better today than I was yesterday. And before the day was over, you had fallen right back into the same old habit that you had before. So, when I say that our love must be, we must be committed to the same love that Christ showed toward us. Christ didn't give up on us because we fell back. He didn't. And so, if Christ didn't throw us away, we have to be careful about throwing other folk away. Love is one of those things that we have to do, not proportionate to, but equivalent. Another one is forgiveness. And to me, forgiveness and love go hand in hand. Because if you don't love folk, you can't forgive them. And you can't say that you've forgiven somebody if you don't love them. This whole thing that we do to make ourselves feel better, I'm going to forgive you, but I don't ever want to be around you again. Clearly, you've never read Jesus' parable on the lost son. The son walked away from the father. The son walked away from the father's lifestyle. The son walked away from all of the privileges that it came from living in the father's house. The son walked away from his brother and went out and found a life of his own and threw away all the stuff that the father gave him, threw it all away. And then he gets up and comes to his senses, the scripture says, and says, I'm going to go home to my father. Now, the way Jesus tells the parable, and I have to remind people, this is a parable. This didn't happen in real life. Jesus told a story, and he told it in a certain way to make a certain point. The way the son comes back to the father, the son doesn't even expect the father to receive him fully. The son says, I know that I've been an embarrassment to you. I've thrown away all of the stuff that you gave me, and I'm no longer fit or worthy to be called your son. I just want you to treat me not as a son, Jesus tells the story. Treat me as one of the hired servants on the estate. It would be better for me to be one of your servants than to be out there in the world all by myself. But in response, Jesus says that the Father doesn't stop at where the Son says stop, treating him as a servant. He says, go get rings and put them on his fingers. Go get a robe and put them around his back. Go get sandals for his feet. Kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a celebration. For this my son was dead, but is alive. He took him back. He fully restored him. That's what forgiveness, that's what Christian forgiveness entails. All this talk about I'll forgive you, but you stay over there, don't come bother me, don't get near me, don't stay close to me. That's what we do. And I understand that's what we do, but that's not the love that Christ showed to us. Christ doesn't keep us at a distance because we messed up. Christ doesn't keep us at a distance because we fell short. We do that to one another. And I don't expect anybody to all of a sudden stop doing it just because I'm telling you that what you're doing ain't Christian. But these are the measures of your Christianity. If you are committed to Christ, the church of Laodicea had a commitment problem. If you are committed to either making the water cold or hot and not simply taking it as being lukewarm, then you have to make a commitment to follow Christ's model. You have to love like he loved, You have to forgive like he forgave, not proportionate to, but the same as, and you have to serve as he served. Those are the three things that typify our Christian walk. Love like Jesus loved, forgive like Jesus forgave, and serve like Jesus served. Does that mean I have to go to a cross? It means that you have to be willing to give up your life. Greater love has no one than this. We read that, and again, we do what we do. We say, well, that's talking about Jesus with his disciples. No, he's talking about us. Greater love he's teaching his disciples. So why would he be talking about just himself when he talks about that? Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to lay our lives down. That is to put self aside in order to meet the needs of others. If I have and you don't have, I have to lay me aside in order to make sure that you have some of what I have. And if you're not willing to do that, then you can't say that you're willing to serve as Jesus served. We want litmus tests for our faith, and I'm running out of time. We want litmus tests for our faith. We want to say, well, if you're a real Christian, then you have to do this, that, or the other. Here's Fred's litmus test. Do you love like Jesus loved, without limit and without restriction? Do you forgive like Jesus forgave and like he taught us to forgive? As often as they sin against you, you are to forgive them of their sin. And are you willing to serve in such a way that you put the needs of others ahead of yourself? And if you are deficient in any one of those things, then you are the church at Laodicea. You are the church that has the resources. You are the church that knows what it is that you're supposed to do, but you simply lack the commitment to do it. You'd rather take it like it is. You'd rather have a comfortable religion than to have a religion that requires effort. Not effort to be saved. Salvation is free. It's not effort to be saved, but effort to live the life. It takes effort to love folk who have done you wrong. It takes work to forgive people and draw them back into you, even though they have hurt you. It takes effort to serve in such a way that you put people's needs ahead of your own wants. And yet, if we are to be the church that Christ would have us to be, those are the things that we must do. That's the litmus test. Love without limit and without restriction. Forgive regardless of how many times or how grievous the hurt that was brought against you. And serve sacrificially. That allows us to meet the needs of others rather than to simply sustain our own wants. The last thing that Jesus says to the church at Laodicea is, I stand at the door and knock. We quote this almost every Sunday. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone would humble himself and open his heart, I will come in. I will fellowship with him. I will sup with him. I will sit down to supper with you and you with me. Understand what he's saying here. Last point I'm going to make. Understand what he's saying here. He's saying, I'm available, but you have to welcome me. I'm there. If I'm at the door and knocking, you have to make up your mind whether or not you're going to let me in or leave me on the outside.